Are you listening?
This is the Rob Scott Show.
Damn.
I mean, really, like, if we're not trying to change the world, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Welcome back to the Rob Scott Show. I am Rob, and I'm here with Sarah. How you doing today, Sarah?
I'm good. Good to see you.
It's good to see you.
I'm excited for this one today. I'm
Oh,
always excited about
yeah.
these, so I don't know if I say that before everyone, but I
Yeah.
really am.
Well, good. What do you want to get into today?
Yeah, so this week we had a coaching call as part of one of our coaching groups that we run, and you mentioned something on that call that I want to dig into, which is around the idea of free will. Specifically, you had mentioned how there's debate. You've been studying and reading, and there's different debates on, does free will exist? Does free will not exist? And you specifically talked about free will existing in one specific place, which, we'll say place in quotes, as we've talked about time and stuff, but about how free will really lives in the now, and then more things. But I thought that idea in general was so interesting. So just to kind of start there, does that ring a bell?
Totally. Oh, yeah. Well, first off, if it lives anywhere, it has to live in the now.
Right.
And that's a really important thing to understand if we're trying to change behavior. So why is this interesting outside of the debate of, like, does free will exist or not, which, actually is kind of something that's being talked about out there, is, and maybe we can explain why that is and why it's being talked about and what they mean, et cetera. But if we don't have free will, what's the point of trying to change or doing anything, right? It's this idea of, like, if there's no free will, then are we just a victim to old impulses and where we're headed and all these different things? And so understanding what free will is or might be, et cetera, is really, really important. And just as I often try to come back to this idea about, I'm not making any claims truly about knowing anything, right? Like, and the reason for that is that I think that we have a foundational problem in what we think to know is, right? And this gets really close and related to how we talk about assuredness of meaning and all those things. So I want to talk about these, not to claim that this is the right answer, but to help everybody individually consider these things and see if they're useful for themselves, right? I'm much less interested in, quote unquote, being exactly right, but I want to intelligently talk through things so that we can see if they ring true for us and if we can use them and if they become applicable in our life. And I think that that's a better way than trying to, quote unquote, be right about things or get it exactly perfect or whatever. Like, we're going to find out more things about our neurology. We're going to learn more about free will in the future. So I'm not trying to be permanently right about anything, but I think we have some really interesting things to say about it. So do you have any comments back to that before I?
Yeah, I mean, and other people also have kind of studied this. So yeah, I think what I love is that we kind of bring our own thoughts and opinions, but also look at what other people are talking about, because I think the more, you're right, the more that we know, the better we can be, right?
Totally. Yeah. And so, somebody I respect intellectually quite a bit is a guy named Sam Harris. I certainly don't agree with everything anybody says, but I like his mind a lot of times. He's done some great work in the meditation space. He's a pretty good debater. He's pretty funny. He's a very smart guy. And I don't want to represent him or misrepresent him, but it's my understanding that he doesn't think free will is a real thing. And part of that is, in the neuroscience space, there's this idea that everything that happens is obviously determined from exactly what happened before. And to deeply oversimplify it, or at least talk about one example of this, there's no reason to think that if you've made a certain choice in one moment, that in any other, if all things were the same and you went back there, that there would be ever any other time that you would make a different decision, right? That from all the inputs of your history and what you know and what your impulses are and all those things, you made a choice. So if we were to rewind the tape and do that again, there's no reason to think you'd ever make a different choice. And so if that's true, there really isn't free will, or we could see the argument for a lack of free will, right?
I don't think I like that.
Right. Yeah, it's really weird.
Just to throw that in.
We're frozen in a play. It's like we're frozen in a play and there's an illusion of free will or something, which may in fact be the case, right? Robert Sapolsky has said things that 100 years from now, we're going to look back and we're going to feel really bad at how we treated prisoners and things like that, because their bad behavior, we will later illuminate that it was way more out of their control. And we are just telling everybody, hey, be a good actor, behave well. but that may be much harder for people than we realize. And I agree with a bunch of that. I think we will probably look back and think that we've been a little barbaric with how we treat people, et cetera. But I also think that even if it's only an illusion, there's a specific useful part where we're trying to navigate choice and decisions and determining what we want to do and all these things. Um, and I want to point out also that whether these are true or not, and let's say there is no free will, most of your conscious attention in any given day is trying to navigate choice and decision and what should I do and how should I behave. And all of those, whether it's an illusion or not, doesn't really matter because your subjective experience is without a doubt one of trying to choose and trying to make decisions and trying to use your willpower and trying to change behaviors or stick with old behaviors that you like or whatever, right? This is almost and the only thing we're doing, right? That's almost the only thing that we're trying to do in all its different forms and fashions. So the problem with this and where these arguments for no free will actually have some grounding is if we actually get into the difference between the now, this moment, this ongoing kind of energetic moment that we're in, and the judgment of time. Okay. So if we think about modeling time in any way, we can start to see how actually there's really strong argument where there's no free will. Let me explain that. So if I consider time like a period of time in the way that I did before, where I say, hey, this action happened and there were all these preceding impulses and actions to it. So there's no way to explain it any other way. As soon as I've added a past and an amount of time and I'm looking at it, that is determined, especially if we're looking at the past. So if we look at time objectively and just kind of hold it out in front of us and imagine it, within time, looking at the history of something, there is no place for free will because it's already been determined. That's what the passage of time is. It means that the past has been determined and the future we consider to be probabilistic. And this now, in science anyway, is the moment where that probability turns into what got determined and what was.
Right.
So if we're considering time, there's a good argument that in time there's no free will, right? Because it's already been determined in the past. And in the future, there's no free will because it's all probabilities and we can't do anything there. So that's objectively looking at time. We can look at time subjectively in the same way. So literally from your point of view, looking at your past, you have no agency of free will in the past. What's done is done. You literally can't go back there and change anything.
Sure.
So there's no free will
Sure.
in the past of time. And there's no free will in the future of time because you're not there. You can't do anything about it. You could set all kinds of intentions or hopes or whatever, but to actually take action or do anything that would be an act of will, free will, you're just not there. So I think that's really interesting to imagine that the only place that free will could exist, if it exists at all, is actually in this moment, right? And so this brings up a whole nother chapter that's really important about self and what self is and what actual behavior change is. But if we just pause there for a second, does that make sense to say that literally this moment is different than time in that that is the place where you could move your attention or decide to do a different behavior or decide to eat the Cheetos or not eat the Cheetos or decide to go running or not running? Like this is the moment where any of that happens. Now, side note, a lot of what we're doing in procrastination or even planning is we're kind of kicking the behavior that we want to happen down into the future, whether that's 20 minutes in the future or 2 weeks into the future or 2 years into the future, hoping that our future self that we are, putting burden onto, right, can do it then instead of choosing to do it now. Just imagine how much more powerful it would be if we could actually in the moment make the choice, do the thing, and apply again, whether it's illusion or not, what seems to be our willpower, what seems to be our agency into the moment to do the behaviors that were most important to us and to move our attention in ways that were the most self-serving.
Yeah, well, and I that's very close to some of the stuff that you're saying on the call, and I had so many questions. So I mean, I have so many thoughts right now.
Yeah.
One is I like that we're not trying to land in a camp of isn't there free will. We're just rather what is the most useful kind of takeaway from this and how can we use it as a skill for ourselves. So assuming that free will does live in the moment, I mean, one of the frameworks you talked about free will that I wanted to ask you about specifically you talked about it in terms of, like you said, prisoners, right? Like how
Hmm.
different people act, and can't change the past. My thought is, like, where does that come? What are your opinions on where that comes into play for things like addiction and addiction recovery?
Yeah.
And also, you know, what was striking me as you were talking is that there is free will in the moment, right? Where we feel like you and I have talked on the podcast about different ways and skills that people can build to have more agency, have more
Hmm.
control over the moment, the now,
Yes.
what's happening, not what we're thinking about happening. And the difference between actual feeling of free choice or feeling like you have some agency versus the illusion of feeling like you have free choice and not doing, and not really actually wanting the responsibility of having to make a decision, like
Yeah.
the procrastination. So I don't know where you want to start, but these are all things that
Well,
I could branch off and talk
there's
about.
so much subtlety there. Remember the second one for me, because I want to
Okay.
talk about the addiction one for a second and equate it to not just an alcoholic or addict, but in the way that so much of our life is reflexive, right? Like there's reflexes happening. And what I mean by that is they're automatic and they're unconscious. Most people think of their emotions as totally a reflex, meaning it feels as though your emotion is happening to you, that you don't have any agency with it,
Right.
that it's arising, and all of a sudden you're almost a victim to that emotion. That, and yes, it feels internal, but it almost feels external to you in some sense, like it's an, sadness is an attacker of you in some way, right? That it's and we don't see how much our own thought pattern is participating, but it can be both a reflex, but also it can be a choice or an action or something that
Right.
we're
Right. Right.
participating. Like if you choose to think a certain way, you can manifest different emotions, etc.
Sure.
And
Sure.
thought is like that too. A lot of thought is automatic and reflexive, and then some of it is considered and chosen, right? We can actually choose thoughts, but if you don't choose thoughts, thoughts will still keep coming because there's reflex, there's automatic. So sometimes we call that unconscious, right? Like meaning we're not doing
Hmm.
it consciously. We may become aware of it, but it's happening kind of unconsciously outside of our intention. And so again, this has to do everything with free will, because when we're talking about free will, we're talking about some sense of you making a choice based on values and desires and all these things, and then being able to take action on that, right? That's what we mean, or at least what I mean by free will is, are you choosing, or are you just a victim to history, your own genetics, the past, like everything that's happened right up to this moment? And is everything reflexive, even if we have an illusion of this control, right? Do we actually control anything? And so clearly we don't control everything, right? It's not magical like The Secret or something where we can just have a new imagination and be a wizard and poof, the whole world is totally different. Like there's some things that are out of our control, and it appears like there are some things that are in our control. But within our behavior, so much more is like reflexive and automatic and unconscious
Right.
than most of us realize, right?
Right. Which is why
And so,
addiction is so interesting, because it
yeah,
can ride the line where you can look at someone and say, you chose to do that behavior, which
yep,
led to X, Y, and Z. Or you can look at someone and say, you've done enough of this substance that has altered the biology.
yep,
Just like I can't choose to stop beating my heart, but I can choose to put a gun to my head. Like those
totally,
are,
yep.
if you look at the outcome, like that's why I think it's so interesting.
Yeah. And so, the 100 years later, looking back and judging people differently, like, will we look back and realize that all of that, come on, Sam, just stop drinking, really may be out of his control. And actually if you are addicted and want to get sober, many of the paths to sobriety let you call it, and again, whether it is or isn't, I'm not worried about being right
Sure,
here,
sure.
but let you call it like a disease, right? They are, uh, whether that's true or not, what that can afford you is to put it out of your own moral goodness or badness and say, like, I'm a victim to this system, this thing, this disease, biological or mental or otherwise. And from that, now, what do I have to do to manage this disease or do whatever? And that might mean, being sober continually or whatever you're, not choosing to put it back to your lips, et cetera. Um, so we're constantly like doing these stories and trying to change the meaning so that we can, am I owning this? Is this a fault in me? Which makes it what, if you feel it's a fault in you, it might be harder to not do the drink because you feel horrible about yourself. So you want another drink. But if you have the excuse of it being a disease, that can make you, there's nothing wrong with you. You just have a disease that, okay, I have to manage this thing. So then somehow at the core, you're okay. And with that, you can have the inner strength to not take the drink, et cetera. Right. I'm not saying that there's not evidence that it's a disease, whatever. I'm going to stop defending these things and just talk, right? But how much of us is on autopilot and is trying to react to reflex is actually normally way more than we think it is. Like, we're way more habitual, we're way more unconscious, we have way more reflexes going on than we really, believe or know, usually. And then on top of that, we seem to be making choices, right? We're making choices. And if you want to meaningfully change your behavior, if you want to stop eating certain things, start an exercise thing, get better at your business, change your, whatever the behaviors are that you want to do, you're going to have to manage changing your behavior, using will to move a thing, or changing the reflexes, right? So let's think about that. This is those two domains. You could use willpower in the moment and have all these reflexes that are working in the same way they've always worked, that have shaped you into the kind of behavior you've been doing habitually forever, right? And not change any of those reflexes or impulses underneath, and just use willpower on top to make a new decision, right? That would be one sort of way to think about free will. Longer term, if we can do that enough, right, all of a sudden that can repattern some of those reflexes, so it becomes much more normal, like I often say, to become a runner or to become somebody who works out. And it's actually changed your sense of self, because now in the pattern of you and the impulses, you might feel bad if you don't do that good behavior or whatever, right? If all of a sudden it's not happening, it's like, wait, I'm a runner. Why haven't I gone running in a couple of days? I got to go running, right? So, but at the beginning of that change is, do you have free will to make a new choice and do a different behavior to start that off? Right now, we use other tools to pattern things into the impulses so that we can change more automatically and all those things. But for the everyday person that's not necessarily working with us, how do you master your free will? How do you gain more agency and control over these things? Go ahead.
Right. Yeah. I was just going to ask another question, and excuse my ignorance. I haven't done as deep kind of a deep dive as you, as what other people are talking about. But like for the kind of work that we're talking about and what you offer, I mean, I would have to say that free will is, we are saying that there is a existence of free will, because otherwise, what are we doing? What are we helping people with? And I also I think it's undeniable to talk about, or to give a nod to unconscious processes, habituated behaviors, that kind of thing too. They're very closely related, right? We can almost flip the words when we say unconscious or, free will or conscious, but they're not quite the same. Does it break down at thought? Does it break down at behavior? Like, what do you think the crucial difference between like a conscious behavior and an active choice or free will is? Because I would have to think that there's a subtle difference, but I'm not sure what it is.
Well, I would say they're all involved, right? So we split up thinking, feeling, and behaving to talk about them in their own realms, but you're a whole system as a person, and those are all going on, right? To behave a certain way, you're going to feel a certain way while you're doing it, and you're going to be thinking certain things while you're doing it. So the thought, emotion, and behavior is all happening at the same time. We peel them apart. Do you have more agency at moving around a thought, or just moving a behavior? Or like, will it help you to do the behavior if you think differently first? How could you do the behavior? How could you do the behavior if you didn't even think about doing the behavior, unless it was automatic, right? Unless it was a habit that you were doing kind of unconsciously. How could you go for a run unless you actually thought of going for a run, right? So it's not that there's a distinction in here. It's just, my point is, if I suggest, okay, here's some cost if you don't do it to incent you, like, we'll pay you money if you do, or we'll injure somebody you care about if you don't, like, here's some incentive. Now, are you capable of meditating, just sitting quietly for 10 minutes? I don't mean the quality of meditation or whatever, but like, could you make that decision? You wouldn't have done it otherwise, but now something's happened, and you then can either choose to do it or not. And, adding that incentive, somebody might say, well, now you've changed like the lead in, so of course they'll do it because now they're incentivized to do it. But so let's take the incentive away. If I just ask someone, could you go meditate right now? Is it a real idea for them to say, yes, I could, or are we all just like, I mean, it seems that it's obvious that at some point that we're making some choices, right?
Right. Now, totally.
Now, when we add time to that, or we add bigger context to that, like the whole universe, you could start to philosophically get into arguments where from those points of view, you're not in the point of view of the subjective person making the choice. And you're saying, well, that object within that whole system couldn't have possibly chosen any different. Everything led up to that moment to do that.
Right.
And from there, you could say, okay, maybe there is no free choice. So again, I don't want to be in that debate. Almost bores me. Like it's just silly.
Well, it's
right?
too one dimensional, because to your point, I mean, there's layers, and we've talked about layers even beyond thinking, feeling, and behaving, right?
Yeah.
We're like, that's actually, we've talked about the fundamental shift in this thing that happens before even self comes online, and then your self thinks, feels, and behaves.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can understand that. I can understand why that would feel kind of not the point.
Right. It's kind of not the point. And we can throw, if we don't like the words free will, it's like, can you choose? Are you capable of choice?
Right.
Are you capable of behavior change? Are you capable of altering the rest of your day willfully or not? Right.
Right.
And so as soon as from your point of view, any of that seems meaningful, then it's meaningful to talk about free will. But let me get to the time part and why that matters a lot. Okay. I think it is very useful to think of it as though within time, there is no free will. Again, objectively, when we look at it, that's the perspective where you can see, okay, maybe there's no free will. But subjectively, internally, you can't change your past, and there's nothing you can do about your future. The only place where you can do anything differently, right, or change to behave in any way, or think in any way, or focus in any way, or do anything, is in this moment. Like that's what's on the table. Now, something else that the reason I brought that up on that coaching call the other day was that what is polluting this moment is quite often all these old concepts or thoughts, or in a bigger sense, what I talk about as the self. Okay. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to do a quick equation, and then we can go through any questions that you have, but I'll just state it out front. If we can say that there's no free will within time, and that if free will, or where free will exists, is in the now, in this moment, if that can make sense, let me also say that the self requires time, right? Your psychological concept of self is the history of you. It is all of your memories, everything that you've learned over time. The self is quite literally based in time, right? It requires time. So I think it's useful, and again, not anything I would argue for literally, but I think this is a really useful concept. There's time, and there's no free will in time. There's self that totally depends on time. So there's actually no free will in self. Okay. There's no free will in self. All right. And why is that useful? Well, what I mean by self is when I'm bringing the historical patterned version of me, self, into this moment, right, as a concept, that self is habitual and patterned and has all its opinions. And like, it's not the new version, it's the old version of me, right? And so it's going to want to default to all the old patterns and all the old ways of being. And actually, if I'm really focused on that self, I'm not going to be focused on the actual behavior and the actual thing to do, the actual jogging or the actual doing of the dishes or the actual doing of the taxes. In fact, that's something big that we are pulling apart for people in these talks, is that self is not always present, right? The ego and the model of yourself is a concept that's got structure to it, and it's very pervasive, and and anytime you do look for it, it's there. So it feels like it's always there. But I think it's really useful that when you're eating a strawberry, or a better way to talk about it might be when we think about flow states, right? Everybody's really interested in these flow states. Well, flow states are defined where you kind of lose yourself into whatever activity you're doing, and you become deeply present with the activity, whether that's shagging flies or doing martial arts or dancing or whatever's happening. Your self isn't there as much, and you're just caught up almost magically or in a flow state into this behavior that's happening. And those are very satisfying. The experience of time.
Well, and you know what else disappears? Yeah, I was going to say time disappears.
Time disappears. Time, as reported, feels incredibly short, right? It's like the time flies when you're in that, right? Because there's no self there. There's actually no time there. There's this deep ongoing presence in the activity of what you're doing. So when we're thinking about changing behavior or doing better behaviors or resisting a bad behavior or doing any of those things, the more that self and time are there, the more inability to have the freedom or the nowness to make a new choice or to use free will in any way, the more that self will be polluting with its old concepts and old ways of beings and old habits and patterns and old ways of defending. No, I'm this way. I never go for runs. I'm not somebody who works out, right? That sense of self that's there starts to dilute our ability to really step into this moment meaningfully and use free will and actually change behavior. But what you'll find is in this recursive way that self can go away and keep showing up, for you to actually change your behavior and become the next version of you, we have to do the different behaviors that justify later and actually changed you, right? So if we're talking about shifting identity, defining a very different way of being and becoming the next version of yourself, we can't be too stuck in the old version. We have to put that version down, really be present in the behavior, do the new things in reality. And then those will become memories that go back to inform the now, newer, fresher, changed self that is now capable of that new thing, that has grown, that has become what it was before, plus or minus, the good or the bad things to become the new version of you.
Yeah, that brings another set of thoughts. But just to go back, that I like that formula, and I like how you took it, I think, a little bit farther than I heard you take it in the call, which is, and I'll just restate how I understood it, is that free will does not exist in time, and self exists in time. So free will does not exist within self necessarily. It exists in now. And what you said on the call specifically, that's what kind of really felt like a breakthrough for me, or an aha moment for me, is like free will is in the now. And to kind of be like, go back to, who cares if we're talking about free will or choice or whatever, it's almost uninteresting. What is interesting about it to me is that clients come to you and say, Rob, I want to make the choice to change, right? And most people who are seeking out a coach or seeking out help are looking to change, and they feel like they can't. And so that's kind of was the part to earlier when I was saying we kind of cling to this illusion of free choice. And I think after hearing what you just said to me, then as people cling to a history of self, less them cling to the idea of having free choice, but not really kind of wanting it, because we want to change, or we wouldn't be trying to do these new things. And we all think that we're capable of it to some I would say most of us think we're capable of it to some fashion. And then it's just like so many people struggle doing it. So that's, to me, that's kind of a huge, you just said it pretty casually, but it's kind of like a huge deal to understand that free will or choice happens in the now and not the model of self or the model of time. Like that's actually a really big deal, right?
It's a huge deal. It's a deep shortcut to changing behavior. This would always be helped with more specific examples. So we can certainly, try to find those now or come back to them some other time. But so that it really makes it tangible for people, like, what is it to choose? I use the example, I think, on that call of breaking, if you think about the self and becoming proud of maybe 3 weeks of a good diet, and then let's say in the moment you break your diet a little bit, a lot of people, if the story of self and the goodness of the good behavior of the diet is really important, and now you've broken that can often inspire us in the story of self to just go, oh, well, now I'm off my diet, I guess I'll just keep eating and I'll get back on it later, kind of thing. And because I broke it, I might as well keep breaking it the rest of today. And then that leads into tomorrow too. And then maybe we're off our diet forever, or it's more difficult to get back on, et cetera. But if we get this moment by moment decision, choice, ability to act differently, even if we catch ourselves acting on an impulse that was very unconscious, like some people say, well, I just found myself at the fridge and I was halfway through an ice cream bar or whatever. And then I remembered, oh my God, I'm supposed to be eating better than this, right? That's a very unconscious thing. Well, that is the moment, again, like once you are conscious, once you are present, not polluted with a story of self, which I want to see if we could talk about that more, because there's a better way to get deeper into what I mean by self. It's not that self isn't in the now also, but self is bringing time into the now. Self is bringing a whole big story into the now, right? So said before, self is in time, it's not in the now. We pollute the now with the self. So the self is also can be in the now, but doesn't have to be, which is.
Well, and you're talking about, you said before, to specify that even further, is a psychological self, right?
Yes.
It's not saying Sarah likes a strawberry. It's the memories of every time I've eaten a strawberry and how it's compared to other strawberries
Yep.
versus the literal sensation of the strawberry
Yep.
taste and the smell and the texture.
Totally.
You know,
Yeah.
that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. And we're gonna stack these together, right? Because there's constant sensations going on, and then there's like our awareness of those sensations and how we gain some agency over moving our attention around. Then of course we get into emotions and thinking and behaviors. And then after that, using all of that to relate to others, right? This is this stack of complexity that we're dealing with. And some of it, I mean, it's all happening in the now, but we're building models in time
Right.
about continual nows, right? To build narratives and stories and try to be greatly predictive. And how do I get somewhere next week? Well, what happened before and how am I planning all that? And much of that is incredibly useful. And I'm not saying that we don't want to do that, but we get lost in that. And what ends up happening is a story of self that has certain capabilities, certain ways of being, certain impulses, certain neurological patterns that tend to keep firing, which tend to keep giving the same sensation, which tend to support the story we've told before. And so then that's when somebody comes up and they don't feel as agentic about being able to change as you said, you know, you might be, right? They actually come and say, I can't stop doing this, or I can't start doing this thing that I really want to start doing, right? That ability to
Right. And
to
maybe
make
it's more like a hope that there's a way to change, but
Yeah, I
you're, to
mean,
your
there,
point, a feeling of out of control.
I mean, that's,
Yeah.
you know, this is somebody who's like, every day I want to get up and be productive. And again, I'm in front of Netflix because I'm, you know, now working at home because of the pandemic or whatever. And I can't, without a boss looking at me from the next room, I can't manage my own behavior, or I just can't get my taxes done on time ever. Right. These, whatever I'm mentioning, like little ones, but these lead up into really big problems for us, right? I can't
Yeah.
stop cheating on my partner. I can't stop
Yeah.
putting heroin in my arm. I mean, these could be like much bigger problems, right? So I can't stop screaming at my kids. Like I see that I'm ruining my kids' life because I can't stop, you know, being abusive because I get so triggered and respond. So some of this is, can you manage your reaction to your impulses, right? If that kid does something and it triggers something in you, and you just respond, that's very unconscious. And I think that even in the now would be an argument for someone like Sam Harris to say, look, you don't have any free will, right? We're totally unconscious. I think I was right in the now. There was no time involved. He just responded to the reflex, right? So that's 100% true. So even in the now, there's not a lot of free will, right? But what we can do is we can become more conscious of those impulses, more aware of how we're unconsciously being pushed around into behaviors and into thoughts and into feelings, right? And start to use and choose by moving our attention around, thinking different thoughts, which inspire different feelings, through that doing different behaviors, actually changing in this moment right now. But here's another way to say it that I think is really important. A lot of our change of self feels like it's going to be a time-based thing, right? That I'll be different later, even if I habituate some of these things or whatever. But the idea is like one day I'll become that, right? That's again us trapped in time. And I really want to make us more now focused, because what's on the table is, did you do it now or not? Right? And people go, well, yeah, I did it now, but I might not do it again. It's like, okay, but let's deal with that. You might not again when the again gets here. Like, just deal with it now. Like that's all that's on the table. That's all that's potentially in your control is this moment. What can you do right now? Is there, if you've wanted to get into investing or something, well, like it's going to have to happen in a now. So like as soon as it occurs to you, are you going to take action on that or not? And this action of kicking it down the line, well, I'm not going to be that person yet or whatever, right? That gives us this space and this time to go, I'll do it tomorrow, right? And that's what change doesn't look like. That's what automatic, similar, habitual, bad behavior looks like. But change looks like this moment, you're aware of it, I'm putting on my shoes and going for a run, and you do it, right? And then you get back and now time has passed and you've actually done the run, which is different for you. And if you then do that again tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, in the story of self, you can become the runner kind of thing. But what's actually happened is you've gone running, like, which is the real behavior change. So let me say one more thing. I know I'm talking about a lot of different things in a lot of different ways, but let's think about being someone we don't want to be. And then you come to a coach and you say, hey, these are the the feelings, behaviors, and outcomes that I would like to change to be a different person. Okay. And I'm going to say that there's two versions of that. There's a version of you that is aware of how you want to change and is capable of it, but maybe it takes some of this choice and free will, right? Like it's not into the reflexes yet. You have to do it consciously. I'm not a runner yet, but I still go running, right? I would say that's success because now you are running, like you got the behavior. But a complaint at that level from a client would be, yeah, but I still have to like use all my willpower to do it. Like it hasn't gotten, it's not in me yet, right? So the difference between that is getting it into the reflexes so that it's an automatic behavior, right? So that now it's a habitual behavior. So I would argue that both of these have changed you. You know, this one is still doing all the behaviors and everything, but it takes more effort, right? Just like learning to drive a car at the beginning takes all your effort to do it. It's very difficult. That becomes easier over time, okay? But very often we're dying to just become this finished version that it's on autopilot. There's no effort because we want to be lazy, because we don't want to do the work to continue to be this person. My point is that going from that middle version that takes a little bit of effort or whatever to the really pattern version, number one, we have ways to deeply accelerate that so that that's really, really fast through repatterning and other things. Okay. But even if you don't do what our repatterning or any of that stuff, it still doesn't take as long as you think. And it still should be exciting because you're capable of becoming this one, right? The problem is having a self that's really upset that you're not already this one when there's a middle version that you have to go through no matter what. And that's based on, did you choose to do it in this moment or not? And if you didn't, later when you realize you didn't, you have another opportunity to do it again. Like now's the opportunity to take the behavior again or do the meditation again or whatever it is. Right. And so not shaming yourself about how you didn't do it or trying to push it off until you did, like get away from the time stuff, come into this moment and go, you know, what have I done? Now, it doesn't mean that we don't plan and we think what will have to be over time and when should I do it and all that. We use time for sure. But in this move of like, when can you actually change your behavior and do something? It's really very much about this moment.
Yeah. And I think like, I love these conversations because if you look at kind of where we started, which is like, oh, you gotta be aware of your meaning and be skillful over your meaning and find like your breath in the now and the present moment, and then be like, this matters, right? Like the more complex we get and the more different kind of concepts that we get into, it's all going to point back.
Yeah.
You know, like if we're saying that free will, if it exists in the now, I mean, and free will is choice, the ability to have choice. Of course you want the ability to leave thinking, right? If you think about our past episodes, or really probably every episode, leave thinking, leave thought, and come back, what, you know, we'll say back to breath, because that's how we talked about it, but to the sensation, you know, and that's where you can then come out of it and choose. Like, I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
I also like, just kind of to veer off into one of the things that you just said and respond about the story of self and self. It's so interesting because, for me, we've been talking about modeling and self as a model, and self as another thing. This is for another podcast. We definitely have to talk about, you also mentioned on that call, concept. Self is your is a concept. Yep. I'm realizing when we're talking about behaviors and choice and kind of agency and who we are, when I think of self, I think of, to me, I associate, those are the things about Sarah, who I am, that are kind of baked. And we started talking about this a little bit in our values episode, and I didn't quite get there. So this is also an expansion on that. They're like how I define who I am, what I feel like is kind of consistent over time. It's my character, it's my interests, it's all that. And when you say you, like when you're talking to me and you say the word you, that's the part of me that feels like I have free will. And they're mirrors, right? Yeah. So it's like my you, like, oh, what are you gonna do today? What food are you gonna eat? Like all these things that feels like it's my choice are only being constructed by the mirror of what I think self is. Well, I'm gonna pick this bagel because Sarah really likes bread, or something like that. I'm gonna pick this music because Sarah really likes, you know what I mean? It's like my response. So I just not landing in any camp, but just thinking again about the original question of, is there free will and what does that look like? And then when we have a problem, right? Like Sarah can't do this, but I really want to change, right? Like maybe to me, that's that distinction of what I'm saying. It doesn't always quite match up. it is so related. And again, to your point, it's all in time.
Yeah.
It's what have I done? What do I think I'm going to do? What am I thinking about what I'm going to do? What if what did I didn't do? And the where things can differ are not at all in my head, in my thinking, in it's literally what is, if it's food that I'm picking, what am I putting in my mouth? If it's, I don't know, it's a sensation, it's the presence of not the you, not you, Sarah, and not self Sarah, but just kind of what is. And I think that's so interesting.
Well, think about how that frozen set of decisions and values and all that stuff, if like the more that we argue for I am that, right, the less changeable it is. And yet that's the thing that wants change, right? Like, and what's really interesting is something else I think we said on that coaching call is that oftentimes that really solidified self wants change. I think a not as useful way to think about that is usually that self wants change external, right? It wants wants the world to change. I wish the world were different. Like, couldn't they be this way and they be that way and all that? But what's way more useful is, are you capable of changing the self, right? Can yourself grow and adapt and think different thoughts, feel different feelings, do different behaviors, be different, be better, be more, be whatever, right? Like, are you capable of changing self? But the more we argue for self or say, no, that's permanent, I'm always that way, I'll never grow that way, I'll never change that behavior, that is solidifying self. But if once you actually test that and you go, no, couldn't you just decide to go for a run now instead of saying you'll never be a runner, right? Like, and if you did, wouldn't you then be someone who had run? And then if you did that again, wouldn't you eventually be able to put on the moniker of I am a runner or whatever, right? So it's that process of this self that gets so solidified down through evidence over time, et cetera, that makes us end up feeling stuck. And then actually sitting in that with all its opinions and choices and kind of yelling at the world to change, right? Like, oh, you make that different. And who's going to do that? What other selves are going to listen to you when they're struggling with their own ability to change themselves or whatever? Like that's not where we're going to get agency or do anything, right? So if this moment is the only place that we can change or make a choice or do anything, yourself is the only place that really, is on the table for agency and ability to change, et cetera, right? Like this is
what I was going to say to you at the end of, what you were saying earlier, is it almost then brings me back to I'm still playing with the idea that there is free will, because the reason I feel like there's free will is I now see that I am someone who doesn't get stuck in self as much as maybe somebody else, which means, right, again, because this is in time, right? If myself can show up differently, how we've been talking about, and I can break up with some of the attachments maybe easier than somebody else who's like, I don't know how to stop being whatever it is. Then it appears to me that I have free choice, free will. But again, that's all in time. And so it's very meta, because you also said something on that call about how even our construction of self becomes our idea of self, because self is so, and if you guys missed it, definitely check out our episode on models, because it was so interesting and I'm still thinking about what we talked about.
Oh, cool.
But good. How self is a model, because it's layers of memory, right? So if the most memorable thing about myself recently is that I can change it and I have this agency, then that becomes my new model for who I am. Yes. I'm Sarah. I'm someone who can,
I'm someone capable of change.
Right.
Yeah.
Which then makes me, my free will then feels like I have a ton of it. That could change in a second. So it's just such a good reminder to me to make sure that you can build a meaningful relationship with now outside of, and I hope that the more that you also had talked on the call in a past podcast about, can you look at a refrigerator and see it as not a refrigerator? And it's just like, I hope that we can kind of say that on each podcast about self.
Well, look at
self and see a little less of like,
let that make sense for people, right? So in that idea, no, the refrigerator thing, because I know we might have mentioned it, but if somebody's just listening to this, it doesn't make any sense. It's important because as you walk into a room, you're throwing concepts on top of everything, but it's happening as a reflex, right? This is not something we're choosing to do. It's an unconscious reflex. And so if you can you look at things without concepts on them? And so really go try this at home, stare at your refrigerator and see if you can see it just as colors and shapes, or even can you see it flat? Can you take away the 3D? Can you see it differently? Or does it just persistently, is it just obvious to you that it's a refrigerator, right? Silly. I mean, you could do that with anything. You could do that with a lamp. You could do that with a car. You could do that with, stuff, because we're walking around and we're putting concepts on top of everything all the time as a reflex, right? This is a part of the modeling that the brain is doing. Let me say one more thing about time, because I like these words. It is different to model time than it is to experience time. All right. And so modeling, I often talk about as equating to thought. And so this is very much the same as it's different to be lost in thought and modeling, right, than it is to be in experience. Okay. But if we think about, if somebody's like, well, of course, there's always time, Rob, fine. Okay. If you want to say that, I would say that now is not in time. But obviously all the nows are in time somewhere, but we have to model time to start talking like that. So if we model time and put it out in thought, and if I were to draw it on paper, it might be like an arrow representing the arrow of time, which is now us taking something very abstract, but turning it into a line on a piece of paper so we can represent it, right? We play with these things with metaphors and all that. But to model time, now we can talk about a period of history. Like I could talk about my 20s, right? Who was Rob in his 20s? That's a period of time, and we can model that time. We can talk about different experiences then, and what kind of character I had, and who I was, and was I an addict or not, or what was going on. Okay. Even if we think about a moment in now, but not this moment in now, I still have to model that. Like we could still talk about one slice of time. What happened at 2:55.00000 PM on Tuesday the 3rd, whatever. Like that's a sliver out of time. But if it's not now, I still have to model it, right? So that whether it's one moment or lots of moments together, any kind of time, whether it's past or future or anything, we have to model that, right? To experience that and talk about it and remember it or whatever. Experiencing time is this now that I'm talking about, that is not any one slice of time, but it is the conscious participation of being present, right? Being here in this moment. And what we're doing in the middle of that very unconsciously is a lot of thinking, processing that's deeply unconscious. Like my system is right now trying to balance me on this chair, right? There's balance models and things going on. I have all my sense organs, sense nerves and things giving me different senses like touch and smell and taste and sight and all these things, right? And then inside on autopilot, I'm doing cognition and emotions are coming up, and like all this stack of my reality in this moment is going on. And a huge thing that we're fighting for is wisdom and understanding of how much is going on there, and how we get lost in a model of time, about time, just like you have a model of the fridge that's very hard to escape. It's very hard to look at a fridge and not put the concept of fridge onto it. It's very hard to be in this moment and not put the concept of yourself on it, right? It's very hard to just purely be in flow. It's very hard to just purely be meditative. And when I say very hard, these are easy things to do, but they're not automatic, because the reflex is that self is online. The reflex is that that's a fridge, right? These are just very automatic. And so if your automatic settings have you deeply blissful, really helpful to society, wonderfully wealthy and fine, you're probably not going to be inspired to do a lot of work. Things are working out for you. Your reflexes are set up just perfectly. But if you're suffering, if things are difficult, if you're not successful, if you're, unhappy, whatever, then I'm going to suggest that the models that you have going on, the model of self, the model of world, the way your brain thinks, your impulses, your reactions to those impulses, all of those things can be deeply and quickly altered through some very specific understandings and tactics. I mean, exactly some of the things that we're talking about here. And this has everything to do with your feelings, your thoughts, your behaviors, your relationships, whether you have free will in the the moment or not.
I also think it has everything to do with the fundamental shift, right? Because it's like, you probably won't get this in the way that you could get this if you haven't experienced a taste of the fundamental shift, because
Well, that's why those are the words, right? That's why
Right.
that's the fundamental
Fundamental
shift, right?
shift,
That's the
right.
the place to start without a question, because it exposes this whole thing. And then, as we often say, the identity shifting part is the mastery of these things in the
the
subtle and in the nuance,
habituation,
the habituation, right?
makes it
Yeah.
automatic.
So that future version of yourself that has habituated all those new behaviors all the way down, so that those new behaviors are in the reflex, that they are on automatic pilot, right? Like your brain is actually trying really hard to make more and more things reflexive. It's trying to learn, which it takes calories and energy to understand and learn and do these things. It then wants to figure out the best behaviors for you, which aren't necessarily the best for the you want to be, but the best that are the sweet candy and the easy thing and the napping and the lazy and like whatever those things are, those become our habits. And then those become reflexive. They become absolutely baked in and automatic. Now, if we decide, hey, what's the smartest next way to be? How do I do that? There are ways to make those better ways of being reflexive, right? The important things to do, all those behaviors. That process of change is really what the best coaching in the world should be about. Like that's what's possible.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well
Awesome.
said.
Anything else about free will? I don't know.
I mean, I'm sure we could probably talk for, weeks
Yeah.
on this, but yeah, no, I think this was a great episode. And I think I like that we touched on a lot of things, and I'm excited to talk to you more about those as we go here. We should definitely talk about willpower. And I like how we talked about time and keep exploring the story of self. And
for sure.
Just so many things.
Yeah. So let's go back. Let's say there's a big argument of whether free will exists or not. That almost doesn't matter. And where free will definitely does not exist. And I'll say this in a new way here too. The reason all of these scientists and people that want to know things often say this is that if it's not true in time in the ways that I talked about it, but a person feels trapped in time, like most people do. Most people just are always modeling time, right? They're always modeling self and time. They feel like they're on a timeline. We're waiting for the future to come. Like that's what we're doing all the time. Then if things can only exist in this moment and you don't have a meaningful access just to this moment, well, you're going to make the mistake to go, well, of course free will can't exist, because when you look at it in the context of time, it can't be there, right?
Right.
So that's what I think is kind of at the heart of some of these errors that it goes into other errors that might be happening in math and science and other stuff. But these are some of the base assumptions that our smartest human beings are making.
Right.
They themselves are trapped in time in a way that they can't see in the way that we're talking about here. And because of that, we make certain knowledge or meanings about things that are maybe not totally complete and accurate, right? But free will doesn't exist in time for sure, because it's determined, the past and the future is probabilistic. So there's nothing there. Free will also doesn't meaningfully and usefully live in the self, because the self is that part of you that thinks it knows what it is kind of frozen, has its ways of being, etc. Free will does potentially exist if it exists anywhere, it exists in this moment. That's where you can move your attention, change your thought, ultimately change how you feel and you behave. It's right now that can happen. And so that should simplify down the story of being different later and all these things down into a simpler space of what should I really be doing this minute? And then either choosing to do it or not. And that's really all that's on the table for you. What we often get lost in is this worry of, yeah, but even if I do it now, then I still don't have the habit and I might not do it later. That's all talk of self and time and other stuff. Put that down and just come back to, I'm just going to go for a run. That's all I'm doing. Easy peasy. That's how change and growth can be easier, and you can actually use free will. You may find yourself falling into more flow states, and ultimately that's how you will truly change who you are in the world and in your self-concept.
Yeah, well, and it's definitely a more enlightened perspective to take, than whether there is or isn't free will. It's just a more balanced thing, and I hope that you guys found it helpful.
Awesome. So this has been great. I love these talks. Let's keep doing them. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Be kind to yourself and everybody else, and we'll talk to you really soon. Bye-bye.